42 years sleeping next to the same man. 42 years knowing exactly how he breathed when he was worried, how he twitched his fingers when he was lying, how his smile changed when he was embarrassed. I thought I knew every inch of that life. And then a painter cut a hole in our bedroom wall to fix a water leak, and what appeared behind the mirror I had looked into every day destroyed everything I thought I knew. There was a safe hidden for years, just inches from my face. And what was inside it wasn't money. It was proof that the man I loved had been patiently and methodically destroying me, all while I slept beside him, suspecting absolutely nothing. But before I continue, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Margaret. I am 67 years old, and for 42 of those years, I was Robert's wife. Before that, I was a high school English teacher for 15 years at a private school, retiring with a heart full of gratitude and the profound feeling that I had done something that actually mattered. After my retirement, I took care of our home, our adult children, the grandkids that came along, and the garden I planted with my own 2 hands. I lived with the peace of mind of someone who had built something solid and could comfortably rest upon it. Robert was a civil engineer. A meticulous, precise man, the kind who never forgets a date, who double-checks any document before signing it, who plans vacations 6 months in advance. Over time, I learned to trust that precision. When he said he was handling our investments, I believed him. When he said our 401k and retirement were secure, I believed him. When he slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table and said it was just routine paperwork, I signed it without reading because he was right there waiting, and I trusted him. That trust wasn't naivety. It was the result of decades lived with one person, of a marriage that had weathered real crises, illnesses, losses. Moments where I saw him cry and he saw me cry, where we held each other up in ways only 2 very close people can. When you've lived through all of that with someone, suspicion feels like an insult to the history you built together. So you don't suspect. You trust, and you trust, and you trust. It was the water leak that changed everything. The moisture first appeared as a small damp spot on our bedroom wall, right behind the large full-length mirror that had been there since we moved into the house 30 years ago in the Chicago suburbs. By September, the paint started peeling. Robert was in the hospital for a routine knee surgery, something planned months ago, no emergencies, no drama. I used the week he'd be out of the house to call Gary, a painter who had worked in our neighborhood for years, a reliable guy who had already painted our entire house once before. Gary arrived early on a Monday. I made coffee, left a mug for him on the kitchen counter, and went to fold laundry in the guest room while he worked. About 15 minutes had passed when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. They were slower than they should be, the kind of footsteps of someone carrying news they don't know how to deliver. He appeared in the doorway with the mirror leaning against the wall next to him, moved away from the spot it had occupied for decades. The look on his face wasn't about a technical plumbing issue. It was something else. I walked back to the bedroom with him and saw what he had found. The double drywall had a cavity. It wasn't an accident, nor was it a quirky byproduct of 1980s construction. It was a deliberate, clean chamber with careful interior finishing, and embedded inside it, painted the exact same color as the wall so it would never be noticed, was a small steel door, a wall safe. I stood there staring at it for an amount of time I can't measure. Gary stepped out without me having to ask, quietly pulling the bedroom door shut behind him, as if he knew that whatever came next was something I needed to face completely alone. My hands were ice cold when I stepped closer. The lock was a digital keypad, 4 digits. I tried our wedding anniversary, nothing. I tried the year we bought the house, nothing. I tried the birthday of Emily, our youngest daughter, because she had always been the apple of his eye. Nothing. On the 5th try, I typed in Robert's birth date, and the lock yielded with a soft, mechanical click that feels like it's still echoing in my ears today. There was no cash. There was no jewelry. There was paper, a black leather-bound notebook, a flash drive, a stack of neatly organized manila folders, and photographs. I picked up the photographs first because they were sitting right on top. They were of a woman I didn't recognize. Blonde, around 40 years old, photographed in nice restaurants, on what looked like a beach in the Florida Keys, and in what appeared to be a hotel room overlooking a river I couldn't identify. In some of them, Robert was right there with her. My husband, smiling at the camera next to a woman I had never seen, in places I had never been with him. I sat down on the bedroom floor with the photos in my lap because my legs simply couldn't hold me up anymore. But the infidelity, which would have been devastating enough on its own after 42 years, was only the surface. Because when I finally managed to get up and open the first folder, what I found wasn't the story of a man in love with another woman. It was the blueprint of a methodically engineered destruction. Bank statements from an account I had never seen. In his name. Transactions that started in 2018, 5 years ago. Small at first, invisible in the rhythm of daily life. Growing over time, methodically, like water finding its way through the cracks in a rock until, one day, the rock shatters. The sun moved across the window from morning until late afternoon while I sat there, reading. Gary never came back. Someone rang the doorbell later, and I didn't answer. My phone buzzed 3 times before I even noticed. It was Robert, calling from the hospital, asking if I was okay, telling me his physical therapy went better than expected, sending a heart emoji. I replied with a heart emoji too. It was the first lie of the new phase of my life. I spent the next 3 days functioning from behind a wall of glass. I saw everything, heard everything, answered when necessary, but there was a transparent barrier between me and the rest of the world that no one but me could feel. I visited Robert at the hospital the next 3 afternoons. I brought him the homemade beef stew he loved, the one I had been making since his mother gave me the recipe right after our wedding, telling me it was the fastest way to her son's heart. I sat in the chair next to his bed, held his hand, listened to him talk about physical therapy, about the doctor saying his recovery was on track, about the trip to Italy we always put off, and that he wanted to finally plan for next year. I answered everything in the exact right tone. I smiled at the exact right moments. 42 years of marriage had taught me how to read his signals. Apparently, they also taught me how to hide my own. At night, when I got home, I'd sit at the kitchen table with the folders spread out in front of me, trying to grasp the sheer scale of what I had found. It was like trying to put together a massive jigsaw puzzle in the dark, turning the pieces, trying to fit the edges, with a growing dread that the picture forming was a portrait I desperately didn't want to recognize. The woman in the photographs was named Jessica. I found her name on a business card inside one of the envelopes. Financial advisor, 38 years old. And inside that same envelope was a stack of printed emails, exchanges between her and Robert that he had saved with the same meticulous care he applied to his construction contracts. The emails were not love letters. They were spreadsheets in text form, asset distribution, wealth structuring, ways to organize properties to keep them out of probate, ways to guarantee that, in the event of a divorce or a death, the money would stay on the right side, their side. There were repeated mentions of one name, Bradley Vance, an attorney specializing in asset protection, a name I had never heard once in 42 years of shared life with Robert. I remembered an afternoon from the year before. Robert had come home with a folder asking me to sign a document. He said it was an update for our health insurance policy, something the provider required periodically, just meaningless red tape. I had signed it without reading it because he was standing right there waiting, and because in 42 years I never had a single reason not to trust him. That document was in the folder, and it wasn't a health insurance update. It was a power of attorney. Broad powers drafted in dense legalese that masked its true scope, but essentially giving Robert the absolute authority to move assets in my name, including the house, which was under both our names. I closed the folder and ran to the bathroom to throw up. Afterward, I washed my face, looked into the mirror of the hallway bathroom, and stared at myself for a long time. 67 years old, 42 years married. And here I was, learning that I had been deceived with methodical patience for decades. I thought of Linda that night. Linda had been my colleague at the high school for 15 years, one of the few friendships that survived both our retirements. She sent me a text every single birthday, without fail, for 12 years. And she had never liked Robert. She never came right out and said it, but there was a deliberate caution in the questions she asked about him, a way of listening when I talked about my marriage that felt more like scrutiny than sympathy. I always chalked it up to some subconscious jealousy, that kind of mild friction that sometimes just happens between people for no clear reason. Now I wondered if she had seen something I had stubbornly refused to see. I called her on a Tuesday night at 10 o'clock, a time I would never normally call anyone. I just told her I needed help and couldn't explain it over the phone. She didn't ask a single question. She just said she'd be over first thing in the morning. She showed up with a warm banana bread and a look that wasn't surprised at all. We sat in the kitchen, and I told her everything, from the mirror to the safe, from the photos to the power of attorney. She listened without interrupting once, sipping the coffee I had made, with the look of someone hearing a story she already knew existed, but hoped she'd never have to actually hear. When I finished, she stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, you need a lawyer before he gets discharged from the hospital." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an emergency. We spent the entire afternoon photographing every single document from the safe. Systematic, silent, like two women who had suddenly realized they needed to build a fortress for a war they never asked to fight. When Linda left, it was almost dark, and she hugged me at the door for much longer than usual, not saying a word, which was the absolute kindest thing anyone could have done in that moment. I went to the hospital that night with the invisible but crushing weight of a digital archive of photographed documents sitting on my chest. Robert was in great spirits, talking about getting back to his morning walks as soon as his knee allowed. I smiled and said that would be wonderful. Inside, I felt a silence unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was the total absence of something that had sustained me for decades and had, in a matter of 2 days, simply ceased to exist. The life I knew was over. I just didn't know yet what the new one would look like. Amanda's law firm was in a small, organized office in a downtown commercial building. Nothing flashy on the outside, but radiating a no-nonsense gravity the second you walked through the door. Linda knew her from a case a mutual friend had gone through a few years back, a similar situation involving a marriage hiding a financial trap, and she had said Amanda was sharp, discreet, and didn't back down from a messy fight. I went in on Thursday morning with the flash drive of the document photos. Amanda received me with hot coffee and plenty of time. She examined every page slowly, unhurried, her face giving absolutely nothing away. When she finished, she set everything down, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at me. What she told me that afternoon was both a massive relief and a horrifying shock. Relief because there was a legal way out. Shock because the scope of the problem was vastly larger than what I had been able to piece together on my own. The document I had signed, believing it was a health insurance update, wasn't just a standard power of attorney. It was a durable, sweeping power of attorney drafted by someone who knew the law intimately and used that knowledge to bury its true reach under harmless-sounding legal jargon. With that document, Robert could sell our home without ever needing my signature again. He could drain bank accounts in my name. He could sign contracts binding my assets. Amanda said we needed to revoke that power of attorney before doing anything else, and that the clock was ticking because Robert was being discharged from the hospital in exactly 3 days. I spent the next 2 days running between the county clerk's office and the bank, revoking the POA, requesting detailed statements for every single account I had access to, putting a preventive freeze on a savings account that was strictly in my name, but that Robert had been moving money out of for years without me ever questioning it. Every step felt simultaneously necessary and utterly absurd, like digging a trench inside my own living room. I was 67 years old, and I was learning how to protect myself from the man I had shared a bed with for more than 4 decades. Robert came home on Saturday. I had put the mirror back on the wall, cleaned the bedroom, and placed fresh flowers on his nightstand, just like I always did when he came back from business trips. The house was exactly as he had left it. Except I was no longer the same person he had left behind. He came back cranky about the pain in his knee and the mobility restrictions the physical therapy demanded. He complained about the surgeon, complained about the insurance company, complained about the hospital chair that had tweaked his back. I warmed up his dinner, helped him change his bandages, adjusted the pillows to the exact angle he needed his knee to rest at, did everything I had always done. He didn't notice a thing. That night, lying in the dark beside him, I listened as his breathing shifted into the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep, the breathing I had learned to recognize as the signal that he was completely relaxed, carrying no burdens. I thought about all the nights that sound had brought me comfort, how I had slept soundly through decades simply because he was there, present, keeping me safe. How much of that had actually been real? The question had no answer. And I realized right then that I would probably never get one. The following Monday, Amanda called me with information a forensic accountant colleague of hers had dug up. The LLC that appeared in the safe's documents had been registered 3 years prior. The majority stakeholder was Robert. The minority partner was Jessica. Any asset registered under that corporate EIN would be entirely untouchable in a standard divorce settlement. It wasn't technically illegal, provided there was no demonstrable fraud when it was established. It was a corporate structure set up well in advance by someone who knew exactly how to use the tools available. Bradley Vance was listed as the attorney of record for the formation of the LLC. Amanda asked me if I wanted an estimate of how much money had already been siphoned out. I said yes. She told me the documents I had photographed indicated at least $500,000 transferred over the course of 5 years. But without full access to his personal accounts and the company's ledgers, it was impossible to know the real total. $500,000. Pieces of the decades of hard work we built together. Pieces of the early mornings I woke up to go teach, the late nights grading papers until my eyes burned, the years we skipped buying things we really wanted because we were saving for our future, for retirement, for the absolute security I thought we were building for each other. I walked out to the garden when I hung up the phone. I stood there looking at the plants for a very long time. The hydrangea bush I planted when Emily was born, my youngest, who is now 38, with 2 kids of her own. The dogwood tree Robert gave me for my 50th birthday on a Sunday afternoon when he walked into the yard with the sapling wrapped in burlap and said he wanted to give me something that would last, that would stand the test of time. I stared at the dogwood and thought about how everything can be 2 things at once, a gift and a lie, a genuine memory and a manipulation. How 42 years can simultaneously be the most real thing in your life and yet built on a foundation you were never permitted to inspect. The first financial attack happened on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after Robert returned home. I woke up to a push notification from my banking app at 7 in the morning. A wire transfer out of our joint checking account. $100,000 sent to a third-party account at a different bank, initiated at 6:43 a.m. while I was still asleep. My immediate reaction was that it had to be an error. A scam, maybe, the kind you always hear about on the news. I called the bank, my heart pounding against my ribs, my throat completely tight. The representative confirmed the transaction. It had been executed using Robert's credentials. As a joint account holder, he was legally authorized to move the funds. From the system's perspective, everything was perfectly legitimate. There was no flagged irregularity. I called Amanda immediately. She told me to get down to the bank branch right away, armed with the revoked power of attorney and every single document related to the case we were building, to try and freeze any future transactions before we officially filed the lawsuit. She said it was a race, and that Robert had figured out something was wrong. But how had he figured it out? 2 days later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a woman. Her voice was calm, almost polite, carrying the precise tone of someone used to making very difficult phone calls without letting a drop of emotion leak into the conversation. She said she knew I had found the safe, that Robert had noticed the mirror had been slightly shifted, that a specific document was out of the exact alignment he had left it in, and that I should carefully consider my next moves before complicating a process that could be resolved much more easily. It was Jessica. I hung up without saying a word. I sat in the living room for a long time staring at the phone, the morning sun streaming through the window. I thought about the way her voice had sounded, not threatening in tone, but profoundly threatening in substance. The kind of threat masquerading as helpful advice. Robert came home that evening much quieter than usual. We ate dinner with very little conversation. He looked at me a few times in a way I couldn't accurately classify. It wasn't guilt. It was assessment. It was the look of someone calculating exactly how much the other person knows. That week, 2 more financial maneuvers were attempted, smaller, more surgical, as if they were stress testing the boundaries of what they could still pull off after the preventive freeze Amanda had managed to secure. She blocked both of them, but warned me they would start looking for alternate routes. And they did. On a Thursday morning, I received certified mail from the county clerk. Inside the envelope was a deed of sale for our home, apparently already notarized and filed, bearing my signature at the bottom. A signature I had never given. I sat at the table with the paper in my hand, reading it 3 times to ensure my brain was actually processing what my eyes were seeing. The forgery was incredibly good. It looked exactly like my signature, in a way only someone who had watched me write for decades could replicate. But there was a tiny detail in the A of my last name that was slightly off. A very specific loop I've been doing since grade school when my teacher taught me cursive, and this signature got it almost right. Almost. I called Amanda, my voice trembling. She told me not to touch anything else, to place it in a plastic folder, and to come straight to her office that afternoon with the original document. She spotted the forgery after 20 minutes of comparative analysis. We filed a police report for identity theft and document fraud. Bradley Vance's name appeared as the witnessing notary on the forged deed. That changed the entire nature of the battlefield. This was no longer just a nasty divorce dispute. It was a felony. It was Amanda who introduced me to David, an ex-cop turned private investigator for the last 10 years, specializing in cases where financial fraud intersected with ugly family law. A man in his early 50s with graying hair and a calm presence that inspired trust from our very first meeting. He listened to everything I had to say, examined the paperwork, and when he finished, he said something that violently shifted my entire understanding of the situation. Margaret, forging the deed wasn't about actually selling the house. It was about creating a documented paper trail proving that you sold a highly valuable piece of real estate and have absolutely no memory of doing it. They are building a case for cognitive decline. The word hung in the air like an anvil. Conservatorship. It took David a full week to bring me his findings. Amanda hosted us in her office, the 3 of us sitting around her conference table as he spread out the files with the deliberate care of a man who has built these timelines 100 times before and knows exactly how heavy each piece of paper is. Jessica had a track record. This wasn't her first rodeo. David had found 2 previous cases in other states, older men, marriages that lasted between 1 and 3 years, divorces that ended with massive amounts of wealth walking out the door in her direction. Always with the assistance of the exact same attorney, always using the exact same LLC shell company and asset shielding structure. She did this for a living. But what David found on Robert was different, and it was the part that shattered me the most. Robert wasn't being manipulated or conned by Jessica. They were business partners from day one. The shell company had been his idea, his initiative, incorporated before he had even met Jessica. He sought her out because he needed someone with specialized financial expertise to execute the plan he had already drafted. What existed between them went way beyond a romantic affair. It was a declared, premeditated business venture. I asked David when all of this had started. He pointed to a date on the spreadsheet he had printed out for me, 2015. The year my oldest son, Michael, got married in a beautiful ceremony we spent months planning together. The year I was diagnosed with a thyroid nodule that required 6 agonizing months of tests and waiting before it was finally confirmed benign. 6 months where Robert was by my side at every single doctor's appointment, every scan, every hour spent in sterile hospital waiting rooms, holding my hand, telling me everything was going to be perfectly fine. And in 2015, while I was terrified of cancer and he was holding my hand, he was legally incorporating the company he would use to systematically bleed out everything we had built together. I couldn't process it in that moment. Amanda slid a glass of water across the table without me asking, the quiet gesture of a lawyer who had witnessed this exact moment of realization in a dozen other clients. I just nodded my thanks because my voice had completely abandoned me. Then came the part about Emily. David gently explained that he had uncovered a bank account in my youngest daughter's name with transactions that made no sense. Wire transfers that appeared to originate from Robert, structured in a highly specific way that would legally implicate her if an investigation ever occurred. Robert had engineered, as part of his contingency plan, an emergency exit strategy that would frame Emily as the party responsible for the suspicious movement of funds. He had built a trap that sacrificed his own daughter as collateral damage. That somehow was the moment something inside me finally stopped trying to find a recognizable human explanation for any of it. Because stealing from your wife, as horrific as it is, still fits inside a comprehensible framework of greed and selfishness that the human brain can process. But using your own daughter as a human shield, the daughter he had rocked to sleep, who he had walked into kindergarten on her first day, who he had openly wept over when she moved out of the house, that fell entirely outside of any human category I knew. I called Emily that afternoon. It was a long, devastating conversation. When I told her about the document she had signed, the one he told her was just for her tax returns, and what that document actually was, the silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and terrified, that little kid voice that sometimes still slips out of adult children when the floor falls out from under them. Calling Michael and Sarah, my 2 oldest, was equally crushing in its own ways. Michael sat in a stunned, protracted silence before admitting he had noticed his dad acting strangely over the last few years, but had brushed it off as just a quirk of getting older. Sarah sobbed, told me she was booking a flight immediately, and asked for Amanda's phone number before we even hung up. My family was being torn apart, not because of anything I had done, but because of what had been done to me, and to them, for decades. And I was still the only one living inside the epicenter of it. Amanda told me our absolute best defense against a petition for conservatorship, which she was certain Vance was gearing up to file given the rapid escalation of their maneuvers, was to preemptively secure an independent psychiatric evaluation before any legal action was officially taken. 2 doctors, entirely unaffiliated with either side, attesting to my cognitive capabilities. Building a defensive wall before the siege even began. I scheduled the evaluation for the following week. And I went back home, to the dinner table with Robert, to watching evening television, to the white noise of domestic life operating exactly as it always had, while underneath it all, that deafening silence that only I could hear just kept growing and growing. The attack happened on a Thursday morning with clear blue skies and a late winter chill in the air. I had left the house early for an appointment with my cardiologist. Just a routine 6-month checkup, something I've done ever since I had a mild arrhythmia at 64. No drama, no emergency, just the standard monitoring my doctor requested. The clinic was downtown. It was a beautiful day, and I decided to walk, like I enjoy doing when the weather is nice, taking the route I've known for years, through the streets of the neighborhood we had turned into our home. On my way back, less than 2 blocks from my house, a car hopped the curb. It wasn't a distracted driver. It wasn't someone having a medical emergency behind the wheel. The car actively accelerated before mounting the sidewalk and swerved right back onto the asphalt after blowing past me, continuing at a normal speed, never hitting the brakes, the driver never looking back. If I hadn't taken one instinctive half-step to the side in that exact second, an instinct I still can't explain, it would have hit me dead on. I stood frozen on the sidewalk for seconds that stretched into eternity, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, trying to comprehend what had just happened. An older man who had witnessed it from across the street came running over, asking if I was all right. I told him yes, that I was just badly shaken. Before he left, he handed me a piece of paper. He had memorized the license plate. I called David the second I got home, my hands still shaking. I gave him the plate number. 2 hours later, he called me back. The car had been rented 2 days prior using a fake ID, but the rental agency's security camera had clearly captured the face of the person at the counter. David texted me the still frame. I didn't recognize the kid, a guy in his early 20s. David did. He was listed on corporate filings as an administrative assistant at Bradley Vance's law firm. The connection was a straight line, zero room for interpretation. David said something on that call that I already knew, but desperately needed to hear someone else say out loud so I could finally act on it. When we cross the line into cars jumping curbs, we aren't just fighting over money anymore. That afternoon, with Linda sitting beside me because Amanda was stuck in court, I filed a police report for attempted murder. The detective who took my statement was a woman in her 40s, and her eyes grew sharper and colder with every detail I laid out. She immediately opened an official investigation. I walked out of the precinct into the late afternoon sun and tried to process what I had just said out loud for the very first time. Attempted murder. Those are words that belong in movies, in newspaper headlines, in other people's tragedies. Not in the life of a 67-year-old retired English teacher who tends to her hydrangeas and makes beef stew for her recovering husband. 2 days later, the court summons arrived. Bradley Vance had filed a petition for conservatorship on Robert's behalf. The filing alleged that I was exhibiting severe signs of senile dementia, extreme mental confusion, and a total inability to manage my own affairs. Attached as evidence was a medical evaluation signed by a doctor I had never met, detailing erratic behaviors I had never exhibited. And there was a photograph. It was a picture of me, standing on a sidewalk, looking completely lost and dangerously disoriented. I recognized the exact moment immediately. It was the split second right after the car almost ran me over, when I was standing there in shock, trying to process the trauma, staring blankly into space. Someone had been close enough to capture that exact fraction of a second on camera and weaponize it as proof of my dementia. The sheer, staggering premeditation of it knocked the wind right out of me. Amanda filed our response that exact same day. The independent psychiatric evaluation was Exhibit A. 2 board-certified doctors, a neurologist and a psychiatrist with zero ties to anyone involved, swearing under oath that my cognitive functions were flawless, my memory perfectly preserved, my reasoning entirely intact. Exhibit B was the forensic handwriting analysis from the state crime lab, conclusively proving the real estate deed was a forgery. Exhibit C was the police report for the hit and run, directly tying the vehicle to Vance's own law firm via David's photographic evidence. And regarding the medical report Vance had submitted, Amanda had run the name. The doctor who signed the dementia evaluation had his medical license suspended by the state medical board 2 years ago for issuing fraudulent diagnoses. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of living inside the same house as Robert, knowing everything I knew. That night, lying in the dark for the very last time before moving myself into the guest room, using the excuse that I was tossing and turning too much and didn't want to bump his bad knee, I listened to his breathing in the dark. I thought about how intimacy can be weaponized. How someone can spend a lifetime learning every single thing about you, every habit, every vulnerability, every predictable moment of distraction, and use that deep knowledge to build a trap perfectly molded to the exact shape of your life. I locked the guest room door from the inside and went to sleep with my back quite literally against the wall. The hearing took place on a freezing July morning. Michael and Sarah sat in the gallery, having flown in a few days prior. Emily sat right beside me, her face hardened by the crushing weight of everything she had learned about her father over the past few weeks. Linda had asked if she could come, and I told her yes. I needed familiar faces in that sterile room. The family court judge was a woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, carrying the distinctly exhausted look of someone who had seen decades of human depravity and had long ago learned how to separate genuine suffering from courtroom theatrics. She ran her courtroom with a brutal efficiency that left zero oxygen for grandstanding. Vance presented his case for the conservatorship with the slick, practiced ease of a man who had run this exact play a dozen times. He laid out the suspended doctor's report, the photograph of my disorientation, bank statements showing erratic transfers, which he framed as my financial confusion, and Robert's sworn testimony outlining my tragic cognitive decline over the past few years, systematically gaslighting every single real issue we'd had into a symptom of my failing brain. Amanda didn't interrupt. She let him dig his own grave. Then she stood up and presented our evidence in reverse order, starting with the sledgehammer that shattered their entire foundation. She presented the state medical board records proving their doctor had a suspended license, the time-stamped police report for the hit and run, explicitly linked to Vance's own employee by a licensed investigator, proving the disorientation photo was actually the aftermath of an orchestrated attack. The independent psychiatric evaluations proving my mind was razor-sharp. And finally, the forged deed, complete with the forensic expert's testimony confirming the forgery. When the judge coldly asked Vance if he cared to explain why his primary piece of documentary evidence was a confirmed forgery with his own name on the notary line, he stammered and asked for a brief recess to consult with his client. The judge instantly denied the request. She read her ruling with the chilling precision of a judge who had made up her mind long before anyone opened their mouths. The petition for conservatorship was emphatically denied. Margaret was declared in full, undeniable possession of her faculties. The judge immediately ordered the district attorney's office to open a criminal investigation into document forgery, procedural fraud, and attempted murder. She issued an emergency injunction freezing Robert's access to any and all joint assets pending the criminal probe. And she delivered a final, scathing dressing down, spoken in that terrifyingly quiet volume that demands absolute silence from the room, about the abhorrent abuse of the judicial system to fraudulently strip an elderly woman of her civil rights and the severe legal consequences that were about to follow. The silence in the courtroom after her gavel dropped had a literal, physical weight. Out in the hallway, Michael hugged me for a very long time, crying silently into my shoulder. Sarah's face was streaked with tears. Emily squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Linda stood a few paces back, respectfully giving the family space. But when our eyes finally met, she gave me one small, firm nod that said absolutely everything that needed to be said. In the weeks that followed, the criminal case moved with a speed Amanda said was incredibly rare, a direct result of our airtight documentation and the undeniable physical link between Vance's assistant and the rental car. Robert was formally indicted for identity theft, document fraud, and conspiracy to commit attempted murder. Bradley Vance's law license was immediately suspended by the state bar pending investigation. The assistant who rented the car was arrested and, within hours of sitting in an interrogation room, flipped and gave the cops the entire chain of command. Jessica vanished. David tried to track her for weeks, but came up empty. Amanda told me that was par for the course. Professional grifters who build their entire existence around these elaborate schemes always have an emergency ripcord, a backup identity, a stash of cash, a clean route out of town before the walls fully close in. The investigations into her previous victims in other states were heating up, but she was already out of immediate reach. The LLC was dissolved by court order as the divorce proceedings tore through their assets. A significant chunk of the money they had stolen was successfully frozen and recovered. Not all of it. It will probably never be all of it, but the house stayed mine. The savings account in my name stayed mine. And my retirement, which they had tried to bleed dry, was being aggressively reconstituted by liquidating Robert's frozen assets. On a crisp October afternoon, I sat in Amanda's office and signed the final divorce decree. 42 years of history legally terminated by a notary stamp and a few signatures. She looked up at me and asked if I was okay. I told her the absolute truth. I was. In a way, I honestly never thought I'd be capable of feeling again. The months that follow a trauma like this are hard to describe because they lack the cinematic adrenaline of the crisis itself. They are quiet, slow months of rebuilding. The kind of months that don't make for an exciting story, but are the exact place where real life actually happens. Emily started coming over every single week. Sometimes she stayed for dinner, sometimes just for coffee, but she always showed up. Her relationship with her father had shattered into a million pieces, and I knew it would take years of intense therapy to navigate that wreckage, if it could ever truly be navigated at all. She had to reconcile the fact that her own father had looked at her and calculated her exact value as a human shield for his crimes. That isn't something you get over in a few heart-to-heart chats. It becomes a permanent scar. You just learn how to wear clothes that cover it. But she was there, sitting at my kitchen island, drinking the coffee I made, talking about her kids, about her job, about the landscaping ideas I had for the backyard. She was a genuine, grounded presence, not an obligation. And that meant more to me than I could ever possibly quantify. Michael and Sarah flew in one weekend every month. The house, which for a terrifying stretch of time had felt suffocating and actively hostile, started feeling large again. Breathable. It started feeling like the sanctuary I had always wanted it to be. Linda and I went back to our weekly coffee dates, just like the old days when we taught together. Sometimes at my place, sometimes at hers, sometimes at a little bakery downtown we both loved. She never once said, "I knew it." She never once said, "I told you so," in any way, shape, or form. It was the most graceful, loving restraint anyone has ever shown me. I've never explicitly thanked her for it, but I know she knows. I had the backyard completely redesigned in November. I hired a young landscaper Emily recommended, a kid who actually listened to what I wanted and then brought brilliant ideas I'd never considered. We planted a lot of new things, but I kept the hydrangea bush that had been there since Emily was born, and I kept the dogwood tree Robert gave me for my 50th birthday, because the dogwood tree didn't commit a crime. And because I absolutely refused to let another person's monstrous actions force me to destroy beautiful things. On a Tuesday evening in November, I finally attended a local support group for women who had survived spousal financial abuse. Amanda had given me the flyer weeks ago, and I had kept putting it off because I didn't see myself as a victim who needed a circle of chairs. I told myself I was just going to observe. I stayed for 3 hours. I went back the next week. And the week after that. What I learned in those church basement chairs wasn't about the specifics of my own nightmare. It was about the mechanics of the trap, about how love and trust, the very things required to build a meaningful life, are exactly the master keys predators use to get inside. About how financial abuse within a marriage is uniquely invisible because it happens behind closed doors, wrapped in the camouflage of domestic partnership, where the victim often can't even label what's happening because their emotional reality warps their logic. I had signed legal documents without reading them because, after 42 years, trusting my husband felt like the only sane thing to do. And that profound trust was systematically weaponized by a man who had studied my entire existence just to learn exactly where to slip the knife in. It wasn't my fault. It took me a long time to be able to say that out loud without feeling like I was making excuses for my own blindness. But it is the truth. The shame of betrayal belongs entirely to the traitor, never to the one who trusted. On a cold morning in December, David sent me a brief text message letting me know the DA had officially upgraded Robert's charges. Based on the digital forensics pulled from Vance's assistant's phone, Robert was now listed as the primary architect in the conspiracy to commit murder. It was a one-line text. I read it 3 times, put my phone in my pocket, and went outside to water the garden. On a Sunday in March, I drove to the cemetery to visit my mother's grave. She had passed away 14 years ago, but I still went every month. Less out of religious ritual and more out of a need for continuity. I just like having a physical place to go talk to her. I stood there for a long time, my bare hand resting on the freezing granite headstone, thinking about the woman she had been. Thinking about how much she had quietly endured in her own life with a stoic dignity I had always tried to emulate without ever really understanding the terrible price she paid for it. I don't know if she would have done what I did. She belonged to a different generation, a time when women had infinitely fewer tools to fight back. But I felt deep in my bones that she would have recognized what I did as absolute necessity, as an act of radical self-respect. And for me, that was enough. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was setting, stopping in the garden before walking up to the front door. I stood looking at the hydrangea bush. Right at the top, pushing through the dead winter wood, was a brand new cluster of pale green buds, reaching aggressively upward with the silent, stubborn defiance of living things that refuse to ask for permission to grow. 67 years old, a 42-year marriage burned completely to the ground. And yet, here I was, still standing, still planting things, still watching new things bloom. I learned that blind trust isn't a virtue, it is negligence of the self. Realizing that isn't cynicism, it's maturity. I learned that decades of intimacy are absolutely no guarantee of basic human decency, and that realizing that fact hurts in a way that doesn't just ruin your present, it retroactively poisons your entire past, rewriting your history in a way no judge's gavel can ever fix. But I also learned that you can survive it. You can walk out the other side. That clarity, even when it arrives decades late and brings you to your knees, eventually sets you free. That there are people who will hold the line with you when you are at your absolute lowest, and that discovering who those people are is one of the most breathtaking gifts a crisis can give you. And I learned that dignity isn't something other people grant you. It's what you aggressively decide to keep for yourself, even when every single person around you is orchestrating a masterclass to convince you that you are weak, that you are crazy, that you are blind, and that you have no idea what is going on. I have every idea. I see everything, and I am still right here. I walked inside, locked the front door behind me, and put the kettle on the stove. Life was moving forward, and it finally belonged entirely to me. Now, if this story left you speechless, hit that subscribe button and tell me down in the comments, which part of this betrayal made your jaw drop the hardest? Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. I'll see you there.